For magic in the Middle Ages was not like the movies. There were no wizards in tall towers, no schools of sorcery. Magic was something ordinary. It was a tool, like a hammer or a spade. People used it to solve everyday problems. It was woven into the fabric of life, as common as baking bread or mending a fence. For most people, it was not evil. It was just a part of how the world worked. Imagine you are a peasant in a small village in the 12th century. Your life is hard. You depend on the land. A bad harvest means you could starve. A sick cow could ruin your family. A fever in a child could be a death sentence. There were no doctors, no insurance, no science to explain why things went wrong. There was only work, faith, and a little bit of luck. And magic was a way to manage that luck. So if your cow suddenly stopped giving milk, you wouldn't just shrug. You would suspect something was wrong. Maybe a neighbor had put an evil eye on it. Maybe a mischievous spirit was to blame. So you would do something. You might hang a hold stone, a hag stone, over the stable door to ward off bad spirits. You might tie a red thread around the cow's tail. You might say a few special words that your grandmother taught you. This wasn't a grand ceremony. It was a practical solution to a pressing problem. It was folk magic. This magic was rarely about power or domination. It was about protection, healing, and influence. It was defensive. People wanted to keep their families safe. They wanted to protect their livestock and their crops. They wanted to find lost things. They wanted love. They wanted to know the future, just a little bit, to ease their anxiety. A woman might use a charm to ensure her husband stayed faithful. A farmer might use a ritual to make sure his fields were fertile. A sailor might buy a charm to guarantee a safe voyage. Who were the magicians? They weren't mysterious figures in cloaks. They were people in the community. The local midwife was often one. She knew about herbs. She knew how to deliver a baby, and she knew the words to say to protect the mother and child from harm. People called these practitioners cunning folk, wise women, or charmers. The local blacksmith was another source of magic. He worked with iron, a metal believed to have protective powers against fairies and evil spirits. A horseshoe nailed over a door wasn't just for decoration. It was a powerful magical ward. These people weren't seen as evil, at least not usually. They were respected members of the community who had a special skill. You would go to them for help, just as you might go to a carpenter to fix a chair. They charged a small fee, maybe a loaf of bread or a few eggs. Their knowledge was passed down through families or from master to apprentice. It was a trade. The world they lived in was enchanted. It was full of forces, seen and unseen. Fairies, or the good folk, were real. They lived in hills and forests. You had to be careful not to offend them. You might leave out a bowl of milk to keep them happy. Ghosts were real. Spirits were in the streams, the trees, and the rocks. God and the devil were real, of course, but so were all these smaller, more immediate powers. Folk magic was the set of instructions for navigating this world. It was a user's manual for a mysterious and often dangerous reality. It was also intensely local. The magic practiced in an English village would be different from the magic of a German forest or an Italian mountain town. The spirits had different names. The protective herbs were different. The charms were in the local dialect. This magic grew out of the soil of a place. It was based on generations of observation, superstition, and tradition. It was a system of cause and effect. If you did A, then B would happen. If you wanted to stop a wound from bleeding, you might press a certain kind of stone to it while reciting a specific phrase. To the person doing it, this was no different from planting a seed to grow a plant. It was a natural law they were tapping into. They didn't always need to know why it worked. They just needed to know that it did, or at least that it might. In a world with few other options, might was often good enough. This was the foundation of folk magic. It was not a belief system you chose. It was simply part of the world you were born into. Folk magic was not about abstract power, it was about physical things. You needed the right ingredients, the right tools, and the right words. Magic was a craft. It required knowledge of the world around you. The fields, forests, and rivers were a living apothecary, a magical toolbox for anyone who knew how to look. Herbs were at the heart of it. They were the most common ingredient, but people did not separate the medicinal properties of a plant from its magical ones. They were the same thing. Rosemary was good for memory, so you might tuck a sprig of it into your cap before a big meeting. But you might also burn it to cleanse a house of bad spirits. Mugwort was hung over doorways to protect against evil. St. John's wort was a powerful protector against witches and the devil. It was often picked on a specific day, St. John's Eve, to maximize its power. The knowledge of these plants was vital. A wise woman knew when to harvest them, how to dry them, and how to combine them. This was a science, in its own way. But it wasn't just plants. All sorts of things held power. Stones were important. A stone with a natural hole in it was especially lucky. You could peer through the hole to see fairies or to break a witch's spell. Smooth river stones could be used for divination. Certain gemstones were thought to have specific properties. A bloodstone was thought to stop bleeding. An amethyst was thought to prevent drunkenness. Metals were also key. Iron was the most powerful. Fairies and many evil spirits were thought to hate it. This is why horseshoes were so important. It wasn't just the shape, it was the material. A knife or a nail could be used to ward off a spirit. Lead was used for curses. A curse might be inscribed on a thin sheet of lead, called a curse tablet, and then buried or thrown into a well. The idea was to place the curse in a dark, cold, and hidden place where it could do its work. And then there were the parts of animals and people. These were considered very potent. A rabbit's foot for luck is a faint echo of this belief. A wolf's tooth might be worn for courage. A piece of a hangman's rope was thought to have powerful magic for curing illnesses or finding treasure. Things associated with life and death held the most power. Hair and fingernail clippings were often used in love magic. They contained a person's essence. If you had a piece of someone, you had a link to them. You could use it to make them love you or to harm them. This is why people were careful about disposing of their hair and nails. You wouldn't want them falling into the wrong hands. Words were just as important as the physical ingredients. A spell was not just a collection of herbs. It was an act. And that act often involved speaking. When charms were recited over a potion or a wound, these charms were often rhyming couplets, making them easy to remember and pass down. Some words were believed to have power in themselves. The names of God, Jesus, or the saints were often included in charms. Other charms used garbled or nonsensical words, a jumble of sounds that were believed to hold an ancient power. The performance mattered. You had to say the words with intention, with belief. You had to say them at the right time. Timing was everything. Magic was tied to the cycles of nature. The phase of the moon was critical. You would perform a spell for growth or increase during the waxing moon. You would perform a spell for banishing or decrease during the waning moon. The time of day was also important. Sunrise and sunset were powerful times, moments when the veil between worlds was thin. Certain days of the week were better for certain kinds of magic. Friday, for example, was associated with Venus and was a good day for love spells. And of course, certain days of the year were hot spots of magical energy. May Day, Midsummer's Eve, and Halloween were times when the spirit world was close and magic was especially strong. Putting it all together, a simple act of folk magic might look like this. To cure a burn, a charmer might take a handful of fresh comfrey leaves, picked during a waxing moon. They would mash the leaves into a poultice while whispering a charm that invoked the names of 3 specific saints. They would then apply the poultice to the burn and wrap it, telling the person to keep it on until the next sunrise. Every part of this process was necessary. The herb, the words, the timing. It was a recipe, and if you left out an ingredient or got the instructions wrong, it wouldn't work. It is easy to think of magic and religion as opposites. One is superstition, the other is faith. But in the medieval world, the line between them was incredibly blurry. For the average person, there was no line at all. The power of a saint and the power of a charm came from the same mysterious place. They were just different ways of asking the universe for help. People were deeply Christian. They went to church. They believed in God, the saints, and the angels. But this Christianity was layered on top of older, pre-Christian beliefs about the world. The old ways didn't just disappear. They blended. People saw no contradiction in praying to the Virgin Mary for help 1 minute and then using a folk remedy to protect their cattle the next. It was all part of the same toolkit for survival. The Christian religion itself provided a lot of magical material. Holy water was a perfect example. A priest blessed it in a church, but people took it home and used it in ways that looked very magical. They would sprinkle it on their fields to ensure a good harvest. They would put a few drops in their animals' drinking water to keep them healthy. They would use it to wash a wound. It was a powerful, all-purpose magical ingredient sanctioned by the church itself. The saints were a huge part of this. There was a saint for almost every problem. If you lost something, you prayed to Saint Anthony. If you had a toothache, you prayed to Saint Apollonia. This was official religion, but it spilled over into magic. People would use the names of saints in their spoken charms. A charm to stop bleeding might invoke the name of Christ or a saint who was martyred in a bloody way. The logic was that the saint, having power over that specific kind of suffering, could be called upon to stop it in the here and now. Or church bells were another example. Their main purpose was to call people to prayer. But everyone believed that the sound of church bells could drive away demons and storms. When a thunderstorm threatened the crops, the priest would be urged to ring the bells. This was a magical act, performed within the walls of the church. Even the Mass itself had a magical quality. The words of the priest, the transubstantiation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, was a profound act of magical transformation. Some people tried to harness this power for their own ends. They might sneak a piece of the consecrated host, the holy bread, out of the church. They believed it was the most powerful magical ingredient of all. They might crumble it into their fields for fertility or carry it as a protective amulet. The church considered this a terrible sin, a sacrilege, but for the person doing it, they were just borrowing a little of God's immense power for their own desperate needs. Of course, the church did try to draw a line. Church leaders and theologians wrote books explaining the difference between miracles, which came from God, and magic, which came from the devil. In their view, any magic that didn't explicitly call on God was, by default, calling on demons. They condemned divination, spellcasting, and charms. They preached against it from the pulpit. Priests were supposed to ask about magical practices during confession, but this official view often didn't trickle down to the village level. A local priest was part of the community. He understood their fears. He might know that the old woman on the edge of the village knew more about healing herbs than anyone. He might turn a blind eye to the folk customs as long as people still came to church. Some priests might even have participated, providing blessings or holy water for what were essentially magical rituals. The distinction they often made was between white magic and black magic. White magic was for healing and helping, while black magic was for cursing and harming. Most people felt that as long as they were doing good, God would not mind. They were using the powers of nature, which God had created, for good purposes. A healing charm was just a kind of prayer. A protective amulet was a sign of faith. The real trouble started when you tried to compel a spirit or force God to do something. That was seen as prideful and dangerous. Praying to a saint for help was one thing. Using a spell to command a demon was something else entirely, but for most everyday folk magic, the kind used for finding lost sheep or easing a cough, it occupied a gray area. It was a space where the old ways and the new faith could coexist, a messy but practical fusion of belief. It wasn't about choosing between God and magic, it was about using both. While much of folk magic was about protection and healing, a huge part of it dealt with the messiest part of human life, our relationships with each other. It was used to find love, to keep love, and to get revenge. This was the magic of the human heart, but it could also be the magic of the clenched fist. Love magic was incredibly common. In a world where marriage was often about economics and family alliance, personal desire still burned strong. Young men and women wanted to know who they would marry. They performed divinations on holidays like Halloween or St. Agnes's Eve. A girl might peel an apple in one long strip, swing it around her head, and let it fall to the floor, hoping it would form the initial of her future husband. She might stare into a mirror at midnight, hoping to see his face. These were innocent enough. But it could get more serious. If you were in love with someone who didn't love you back, magic offered a solution. You could try to bind them to you. These spells often required something personal from the object of your affection. A lock of hair, a nail clipping, a thread from their clothing. These items were seen as a direct link to the person. A woman might bake a piece of her own hair into a loaf of bread and give it to the man she desired. The idea was that by consuming a part of her, he would be filled with desire for her. Other spells involved making a potion, often with herbs associated with love, like verbena or yarrow. Magic was also used to police relationships. A suspicious wife might use a charm to ensure her husband's faithfulness. Or, if she suspected he was already cheating, she could use a spell to cause him impotence with any other woman but her. These spells show the desperation and lack of power many people, especially women, felt in their lives. Because magic was a way to exert some control over a situation where they otherwise had none. But where there is love, there is also jealousy and hate. This is where folk magic turned dark. If someone wronged you, if a neighbor stole your land or your lover, the law might not be able to help you. But magic could. Curses were a real and terrifying part of medieval life. The goal was to cause harm from a distance. The most common method was through sympathetic magic. The idea was that, like effects like, to harm a person, you would create an image of them. This could be a doll made of cloth, a figure shaped from wax or clay, or even just their name written on a piece of parchment. This was often called a poppet. Then, whatever you did to the image would happen to the person. You could stick pins into it to cause pain. You could bind its limbs to make the person lame. You could melt it by a fire to make them waste away with fever. You would perform this ritual in secret, often while speaking a curse, naming the person and the harm you wished upon them. These curses were not taken lightly. The belief in their effectiveness was powerful. If someone fell ill or had a string of bad luck after a public argument, people would immediately suspect that they had been cursed. The fear of being cursed was a powerful social tool. It kept people in line. You thought twice before cheating your neighbor because you never knew what they might do in retaliation. This magic of harm was often called malevolent magic, or maleficium. This was the kind of magic that got people into serious trouble. While a village might tolerate a healer or a charmer, they would not tolerate someone believed to be using magic to hurt others. This was seen as unequivocally evil. It was an attack on the community itself. Divination was also used in these disputes. If your cow died suddenly, you might go to a cunning person to find out who had bewitched it. The cunning person might use scrying, staring into a bowl of water or a crystal to get a vision of the culprit. Or they might use other methods, like casting lots. This could be incredibly dangerous. An accusation of witchcraft, even without any proof, could destroy a person's reputation and lead to violence. So, this personal magic cut right to the core of village life. It was about desire, fear, jealousy, and revenge. It was a hidden weapon in the daily struggles between people. A love charm could be seen as a hopeful prayer or a sinister act of manipulation. A curse could be seen as righteous vengeance or pure evil. It all depended on your point of view. But for everyone, it was a very real force shaping their emotional lives and their relationships with their neighbors. For the most part, folk magic was just a normal part of life. As long as it was used for good, for healing or protection, people accepted it. A bit of grumbling might happen if a charm didn't work, but that was usually the extent of it. The trouble started when magic was believed to cause harm. When a cow died, when a child fell sick, when a storm ruined the crops, people needed someone to blame. And the person they often blamed was a witch. An accusation of witchcraft in the earlier Middle Ages was not an automatic death sentence. It was often a local matter, a dispute between neighbors. It usually started with a suspicion, a rumor. Maybe an old woman lived alone on the edge of the village. She was poor, maybe a bit odd. She muttered to herself. Then, after an argument with her over a wandering chicken, your butter refuses to churn. The conclusion was obvious to many: she had bewitched your cream. What happened next depended on the community. You might confront her directly, or you might go to the village priest or the local lord. The accusation was serious. It was about maleficium, causing harm through magic. This was a crime, but the proof was hard to come by. There was no scientific evidence, only the word of one person against another. The local authorities had to handle it. Sometimes, the accused would be subjected to an ordeal. This was a trial by a physical test, where God was supposed to show the person's guilt or innocence. For example, the accused might have to carry a red-hot piece of iron. If the wound healed cleanly after a few days, they were innocent. If it festered, they were guilty. Another common ordeal was the ordeal by water. The accused would be tied up and thrown into a river or pond. If they sank, they were innocent and hopefully rescued. If they floated, the water was rejecting them and they were guilty. The church eventually banned these ordeals in 1215, seeing them as tempting God, but the practice continued in some places for a long time. More often, the punishment was less dramatic. If found guilty, a person might be forced to do public penance. They might have to stand on the church porch on Sunday, confessing their sin to the whole village. They might be fined, they might be banished from the village, which could be a death sentence in itself. For much of the medieval period, the focus was on punishing the harmful act, not on a belief system. You were punished for harming your neighbor's cow, not for being in league with the devil. But this began to change in the later Middle Ages. The intellectual elite of the church started to develop a new and much more sinister theory about magic. They became less concerned with simple folk charms and more obsessed with the idea of organized devil worship. They began to believe that witches were not just people who used magic to sour milk. They were heretics who had made a pact with Satan. They rejected God, attended secret meetings called sabbats, flew through the night, and engaged in all sorts of terrible acts. This new idea of witchcraft as an organized conspiracy against Christianity slowly filtered down from theologians to the general population. The invention of the printing press helped spread these ideas. Books like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, published in the late 15th century, laid out a complete guide for how to identify, prosecute, and punish witches. It was a manual for witch hunters. This changed everything. An accusation of witchcraft was no longer just a local squabble. It was a charge of heresy, the worst crime imaginable. The trials moved from local manors to church courts or secular courts with inquisitors. The goal was no longer just to stop the harm, but to root out the heresy. And the key to proving heresy was a confession. To get a confession, authorities used torture. Under extreme pain, people would confess to anything. They would confess to flying on broomsticks, to having sex with the devil, to killing babies. And they would be forced to name other witches. This created a chain reaction of accusations, leading to the Great Witch Hunts. It is important to remember that the peak of this hysteria, the Burning Times, was mostly an early modern phenomenon happening after the Middle Ages had ended. But the seeds were sown in the late medieval period. The shift was profound. Everyday folk magic, the simple charm to protect a home or heal a child, became dangerously suspect. The wise woman who knew about herbs could now be seen as a diabolical witch. A tradition that had been a source of comfort and control for centuries became a source of terror. The world was no longer just enchanted, it was a battlefield between God and the devil, and anyone could be accused of fighting for the wrong side. The simple, practical magic of the common folk was caught in the crossfire.